round 9 here in Columbus, Ohio. TJ Rogers with Jacob Van Lunen on the left. We see Brian Braun-Duin up against Matthew Nicolai. Both of these players X1 heading into the first game of round 9. And we're going to kick things off with a swamp and a plains. Not too much action just yet. The players kind of mirroring each other's actions a bit, but it's a forest that's going to break the mold with just a nice little honor guard to kick things off.
Yeah, so Brian Braun-Duin getting onto the table first. Nicolai had an opportunity to cast Galago Skinwitch on his second turn, and instead declined to do so. He's on the draw. He figures he's probably going to be able to get Brian's last 2 cards as long as he's able to hit land drops 1 through 6.
Yeah, and we've been talking a little bit about the decision. When you've got these 2-mana spells that are also 6-mana spells because of that kicker ability, how to decide when you're going to deploy them on turn 2, when you're going to deploy them on turn 6. We see an Ether Glider joining the battlefield as well. It's that flying 2/1. It can't block, so really it's a pretty single-minded card.
Yeah, and it may seem surprising that he didn't hit a 4th land and play the Calico Skinwitch. This means that he probably has something to do here. It could even be a disenchant. So he has invoked the Divine here, which is great against Brian's aggressive start. It looks like Matthew is a more late-game oriented deck than Brian, so the more he can work his way into the later stages of the game, the better suited he's going to be.
Yeah, and on Matthew's side, we do see this Jousting Lance, which came down to the battlefield. That's going to be really the kind of card that can translate into a lot of damage from a single card later.
Absolutely.
Sergeant at Arms coming down to the battlefield. No kicker on this one. Just a clean 2/3, adding to the pressure, and it's the Skinwitch that we were talking about. Coming down to the battlefield, it's a 1/3. It's actually going to be a pretty nice brick wall in front of both of these creatures, whichever one really.
Yeah, and this is why this card is so good, is because, if you don't want to wait till later and get 2 powerful cards, if you're not hitting land drops, it's something you can do with your mana early on, and the 3 toughness on that does a really good job of taking the wind out of the sails of most aggressive strategies.
Looks like Brian Braun-Duin is going to counter this somewhat, though, by putting this short sword onto the honor guard. That means that those blocks do become a little bit more precarious. It does become a 3-powered creature, so blocking it does become somewhat of a liability. And that's the case. It's going to take it down. We see a Gideon's Reproach to just remove the Skinwitch off the table entirely. We get a little bit of a swing in and clear the board.
Yeah, and, a lot of the time you don't want to use a removal spell on something like a Caligo Skinwitch, but Brian has identified that there is not a 4th land in Nicolai's hand, and Nicolai used his entire last turn just casting that Skinwitch, which means that Brian is likely to be in a situation where his opponent does not have any more gas until he hits a 4th land.
Gideon's Reproach takes down the Honor Guard. We see a Mesa Unicorn hit the battlefield, get suited up with a sword. Not certain how it's holding that, but it's going to find a way. And it's a Deathbloom Thallid out for Matthew Nicolai. This is going to be a 3/2, so it can get in front of both of these creatures pretty profitably.
Yeah, so Brian, if he wants to continue getting in, he's going to have to move that short sword, but we're not really sure what his mana situation looks like right now. And
really, both of these players, he's never gone past his 4th land drop. Matthew never gone past his 3rd. When you've been watching these Dominaria drafts, hitting land drops a pretty critical part of the process in a lot of these matches.
Yeah, when you're drafting, it is very often an important thing to be, hitting land drops at least 1 through 4 in most decks, and in some decks, you really want to be hitting land drops 1 through 6. It looks like Matthew Nicolai's deck does go much bigger, and he's also a green-based deck, so he's not able to cast half of the cards in his deck right now.
So really 4 colors in this deck at the moment. Little bit, because we've got a little bit of blue in the deck as well, don't we?
Yeah, 3 colors.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's going to be a Pegasus Courser coming down to the battlefield. The Sergeant at Arms joining us, and we are going to be...
Yeah, so actually this deck list that I have in front of me is not correct. The deck list that was given to me. This is not the deck he's playing with.
Yeah, this looks to just be a black-white deck.
Yeah.
Maybe from yesterday.
Yeah.
So it's a Mammoth Spider out on the battlefield. It's going to be the 3/5 with Reach. Taking a look at this Pegasus Courser, this Jousting Lance, which is going to end up on a Saproling. Sergeant at Arms continue to pressure. Matthew, he's down to 9 right now. Really, Brian Braun-Duin has been putting the pressure on. Matthew has not really had a chance to get aggressive with this board. We see a Saproling out, but it's really just kind of bunkered up as a 3/1. We see the Pegasus Courser as just a 1/3 flyer that's trying to get in the way. none of these really lining up well against the board that Brian Brandon has been putting down.
Yeah, and Brian definitely has the lead here. He's the aggressor. He's got a big life total advantage. Both of his creatures match up well in the red zone here. And, the earlier narrative that we were working with was assuming that Nikolai, I think, was playing the deck that he had from yesterday. We were given the deck list that he had from that day. So I actually think that Nikolai is trying to play a more aggressive strategy here and is finding himself in a situation where Brian's deck is just bigger.
Yep, the short sword coming on in with that spider. It's got 7 more arms to potentially hold some more, but I don't think Brian's got swords for all of them. It's going to swing in for 4. It's going to be another Mammoth Spider joining the battlefield. There's a Dauntless Bodyguard, the draw for Matthew, but he has never hit his 4th land drop. Yeah, I mean, this many turns into the game, that is just not what you would expect to see. And I think Matthew maybe has the same thing running through his mind.
Yeah, the frustration of not being able to cast your spells is something that happens very often in Magic. It's part of the game. And I believe he did mulligan quite a bit here.
Mm-hmm.
Brian and he both went down to 6 cards, and I think Matthew went down to 5. So when you're in a situation like that, it becomes less likely that you're going to be able to hit those land drops. In his hand, he even has a Dark Bargain, so if he were able to have found that 4th land earlier, he would have been able to, find the necessary lands he needed to keep going up.
When you're looking at this format, there's a kind of this baseline or this assumed where your starting point when it comes to the mana base for a lot of the decks in a format. Conventionally, people are often told that you generally want 23 spells, 17 lands. How do you think that lines up in the average Dominaria deck?
So I don't really like fast and loose rules like that. I think they're good for people who are just starting out drafting, but I think the number of lands you play in a draft deck can be much lower than 17. I think also there are decks where you might even want to play as high as 19 at times. And while the range is usually between 17 and 18, I think that depending on the deck you end up with, that number could change pretty drastically.
Okay. So 2 Mammoth Spiders out alongside that Sergeant at Arms, trying to do a little bit of an impression. Probably pretty difficult to be a Sergeant for Spiders.
Yes. They don't listen very well.
But it's a lot more boots on the ground.
That's a good point. I didn't even think about that.
Their marching is a lot more coordinated.
Yeah. It also probably sounds a lot more intimidating to the people you're marching to.
Ooh.
They assume you have a lot more people than there are a lot more bodies than you might.
Pegasus Courser, Dauntless Bodyguard, and a Saproling, the brave defenders for Matthew Nikolai here. We're going to go ahead and put this short sword over to the Sergeant at Arms, and it's just going to be an all-out swing. All of these creatures getting in with 3 power, and there's nothing really on the opposing side that is going to beat these creatures in combat, nor be able to block really profitably.
Yeah, so Matthew here, he can have a double block on one of these creatures here, probably a spider, and then just chump block one of the other creatures. That would put him down to 2. But that's really his best play here, unless he has something else he can do in his hand.
Yeah, it's looking to be a pretty difficult and dire situation on Matthew Nikolai's side, and he's actually just going to pick him up. We're going to give it a shot for Game 2.
Yeah.
So, Brian Brown-Duin really putting Matthew to the test, and Matthew's now got to go really sweep Game 2, Game 3 to hold his own against former world champion Brian Brown-Duin.
Yeah, and I mean, we got to look at his hand there toward the end. We saw Call of Cavalry. We saw a Dark Bargain. So lots of 4-mana spells in Nikolai's hand there. Matthew just wasn't able to find that 4th land that he needed.
In this black-white deck, we got to see a little bit of it from Seth Manfield yesterday, but tell me a little bit about how these black-white decks generally end up playing out their game plan.
So the black-white deck isn't so much a synergy-based strategy as it is that they're both fairly deep colors in terms of just good cards. And a lot of the time your draft will start out and you'll have a pack where Blessed Light is just slam dunk the best card, then Vicious Offering, then an Eviscerate, then another Blessed Light, and suddenly you're solidly in these 2 colors, and it doesn't really matter what synergy you have. You just have good removal spells and good aggressive creatures. Because there are a lot of good legends also, so you can kind of put together a bit of a historic theme if you want to, but it's usually secondary to just the power level of your cards.
And we did see that Arvad the Curse going around the table earlier, maybe ended up in Matthew Nikolai's deck, could have potentially found its way there, but I bet Matthew would be loving to have what Brian Brown-Duin took in his first pick of the draft, which was that Ariel, actually, the knight.
Yeah, that would be the perfect card for Matthew. I mean, that card is a 4/4 for 4 that then floods the board, kills your opponent's creatures. Just about the best thing you could ask for.
Yep, and then on Brian, we talked about the green-white deck, and I think you said it was sort of in a similar pattern where there's not really a deep synergy in this green-white color pair. It has a lot more to do with just having really valuable creatures, really valuable spells, and trying to kind of go pound for pound.
Yeah, and we got to look there at what Brian's deck is capable of, and a card like Pegasus Courser, which is normally a very good card, is not a very exciting card when it's playing against somebody like Brian here. Brian has multiple Mammoth Spiders. Brian is, again, he's made a deck that has all of the bases covered. He's got tons of reach. He's got a decent amount of flying. He has versatile removal spells and a pair of Blessed Light. He has some inexpensive creatures to get on the board quickly. Brian, while his deck doesn't really have the top-end power level that you'll see sometimes, he has a strong deck that somebody should be very happy with coming into a draft at Nationals.
Another thing that I actually wanted to ask you is that we saw 2 equipment on the battlefield in that game. We saw the Jousting Lance and the Short Sword.
Mm-hmm.
We've touched on the fact that the auras of this format are really a lot less desirable in the way that these games play out. Do you think that translates also to the equipment, or do you think that those ones have a lot more staying power?
So the equipment's much better in this format than the auras are. The removal is good in this format. So oftentimes when you play an aura, you find yourself getting 2 for 1. And what I mean by that is that your opponent is able to use 1 card to deal with 2 of your cards. So if you put your Arcane Flight on your creature and then your opponent uses a Vicious Offering and kills it, then they've used 1 card and you've lost 2 cards. Whereas with an equipment, if you equip your equipment and your opponent uses a removal spell, you can just equip that equipment elsewhere. So the equipment functions much in the same way that auras have in formats where they've been good, but it's not nearly as risky as the auras would be in a format where removal is as prevalent as Dominaria Limited. And
they're able to translate into the late game significantly better, which is really a place that these games tend to go in this format.
Absolutely.
So the players are going to be getting ready for Game 2. We're likely going to have Matthew Nicolai. His deck looked to be a bit more on the aggressive side. We saw that Call of the Cavalry. We saw Dauntless Bodyguard. We saw the Calico Skin Witch. We saw the Pegasus Courser. So it seems to be really right in that black-white deck, which can be a bit more aggressive.
Absolutely.
So the play is going to be the right place for him. Brian Brown doing... just trying to, he's just got 1 game, and he's going to be finishing up the match. He's going to be remaining X1. Matthew Nicolai, he's got 2 games to try and get in that position, but a Memorial of Folly, a good first play, especially, in this black-white deck. Those Memorials, pretty powerful. Yeah.
I mean, they're great in the late game. They, if you get flooded, you still have things to do.
A couple of 2-mana 2/2s, Cabal Evangel up against the Benalish Honor Guard. Potentially they'll be running into each other, but it looks like it's just going to be a little bit of a stalemate currently.
Yeah, Matthew taking a defensive position here. Perhaps he has some powerful cards in his hand. He wants the game to go longer.
Looks like Brian does not agree. He's willing to swing in with his Honor Guard, and now we're going to see actually Matthew go for the block and the trade. Maybe just want to be in control of that situation. When you're on the blocking side, you've got a bit more control on how this combat's going to go.
Yeah, and if you're not attacking with the Evangel there, then you definitely want to be blocking. Sometimes you'll see people not attack and then decline to block, being afraid of a trick, and you kind of have committed to the play of the block once you have decided to pass the turn there.
Interesting. So Sergeant at Arms is going to come down. Calico Skin Witch, another card that's going to come down. This card's been phenomenal for 2 mana. It's going to brick wall that Sergeant at Arms, and we see the Aven Sentry, a card that you've been a big fan of, coming down 3 power in the air with flying. That 2 toughness, less of a liability when it's uncontested.
Yeah, and yes, it dies to a number of 1 and 2 mana removal spells in the format, but just a 3 power flyer is a really, really valuable card in a format like this where the ground can get so stalled so quickly.
We see the Thallid Omnivore come down, and I think I might have spied a Gideon's Reproach in Matthew's hands. So I think he's working on committing to the board as opposed to really eliminating Brian Brown-Stewin's threats just yet, because he did have the opportunity to maybe try and go for that play.
Yeah, and Brian, we saw him go to the sideboard in between games. He knows that Matthew has at least 1 Gideon's Reproach, and when people are playing cards like that, ooh.
A dub? on the Sergeant at Arms. We were just talking about how some of these auras are going to be less valuable, but this is going to come in. This is actually +2/+2. That turns this Sergeant at Arms into a 5 toughness creature. That Gideon's Reproach is not going to be effective against it. It's now got First Strike as well, so it's even difficult to really combine creature damage alongside that Gideon's Reproach.
Yeah, and I think Brian has perhaps found a matchup where he's going to be able to make good use of this aura. He could also get punished by it. If Nikolai has the removal spell, he's going to get a 2-for-1 here, and we're going to see the reason why auras aren't great in this format.
So Matthew down to 13, getting a swing in with this Thallid Omnivore. Brown wants nothing to do with that combat. He can't do a whole lot about it anyway. The interesting thing as well is that this dub, it does turn the creature into a knight. He does have a history of Benalia in his deck, so even a little bit of deck building synergy there.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. History of Benalia, one of the best cards in Brian's deck.
So we've got an all-out attack. It's going to be that Aven Sentry. Now that one is potentially vulnerable to the Gideon's Reproach, and that's going to be the case. Taking that one down and just throwing the Calico Skin Witch in front of this Sergeant at Arms, trying to really stem the bleeding, salvage a little bit of life, and try and get... Ooh! A Vicious Offering. So we're going to throw the block in front of it, sacrifice. That's the kicker ability, not the combat and the card combining, but actually just sacrificing the creature to give it -5/-5. Not quite a 2-for-1 because he did end up losing a creature of your own.
Yeah, I mean, it was a somewhat even trade there, but the fact that he was able to clear Brian's board of threats is, just excellent for Nikolai in this spot.
Blessed Light removes the Thallid Omnivore, and it's an Aven Sentry that is trying to pick up the pieces of this really scattered battlefield that was starting to build up. A couple of quick exchanges, and it's empty except for the Lone Flyer.
And it seems like Brian may be out of cards here that are really that relevant.
Maybe not. Pierce the Sky is actually going to come in and take down that creature, and if there's no tricks, the board is going to be cleared once more. Matthew Nikolai with a Fungal Infection. Was there any consideration at all of maybe casting a Fungal Infection on your own creature to get a sapling?
I think with Brian still at 17, and having not seen any 1-toughness creatures out of Brian's deck, it doesn't seem like that's really where you'd want to be.
We see a Dauntless Bodyguard go into the graveyard. We do see an Eviscerate was one of the cards that we actually picked up off of that one. That's going to be a powerful card. And a Benalish Honor Guard as well, choosing to play the 2-mana 2/2 as opposed to the 1-mana 2/1.
Yeah, and with that Memorial to Folly on the battlefield, Matthew Nikolai has to be feeling pretty good about his chances.
That's a great point, because now any one of these creatures that's been removed from the battlefield, except the Thallid Omnivore, because that was an exile effect explicitly, when Matthew's ready, he's going to be able to just put 3 mana and sacrifice that Memorial to Folly and get back one of these creatures. And there it is. The Pegasus Courser is going to block, but the Fungal Infection is going to combine. We're going to get a Sapling. We're going to take down a Pegasus Courser, that 1/3, with our 2/2. Matthew's got to be feeling pretty good in this game, too.
Absolutely. Now he's built up 7 points of power across 4 bodies.
Call the Cavalry, both great offensively and defensively. These are Vigilance 2/2 Knights. So it's going to be really a lot of pressure coming in, but also Brian Brown is not going to be able to really get return swings in very effectively.
No, not at all. I mean, Brian's not on the board at all. Now he's, basically, he's definitely ran out of threats. Matthew was able to turn that Fungal Infection into a really powerful card.
Blessed Light removes one of them. Another thing to keep in mind is that Matthew is sitting on an Eviscerate in hand as well, which is just destroy target creature. No other constraints, no other requirements, which means that even if Brian is able to get down a threat, which he hasn't been able to do, there's sort of this ace up the sleeve for Matthew, where no matter what happens, he's got a way out of it.
Yeah, and Matthew here able to use Memorial to Folly, probably getting back an Aven Sentry, just really going to apply as much pressure as he possibly can.
Yep, that Memorial to Folly really coming in handy here, and you called it. That 3/2 flyer for 4 is going to go back to the hand. It guarantees that Matthew's got to play to make this turn. We're going to swing in for 5. Brian's going to find himself down to 7, suddenly on the lower life total of this game, and the Aven Sentry is going to hit the battlefield. We're going to pick it up. That was enough. Matthew Nikolai, a very commanding... Really, we saw both of these players building up a couple of quick exchanges, and then when the dust settled, Matthew was the only player who started committing to the board at that point in the game. Really kept quite a few creatures, quite a few threats in hand, was able to continue developing the board. Brian completely ran out of steam.
Yeah, and, there, Brian, he got taken advantage of by playing that dub. Matthew Nicolai was able to use less mana to do more in those early turns of the game, and even though Brian was trying to be the aggressor, that plan fell apart pretty quickly. Matthew's life total was still at 13 by the time he had stabilized the board. Brian then was forced to use a pair of Blessed Lights on 2 threats that weren't that impressive. Thaladwam for, a fine target, but, when you're using it on a 2/2 for 2, you're not very excited. Then Matthew was able to just get really far ahead via card advantage. He cast a Dark Bargain. He had the Memorial to Folly to return the Aven Sentry, and Brian just fell too far behind. I think Brian, after playing these games, recognizes that if he wants to win this match, his most important cards are going to be things like the Mammoth Spiders that he picked up.
Yeah, those were such an incredible asset to his game plan in the first one, because not only were they able to really stop the flying game plan that we've now seen, Matthew's got access to, but also just having that large toughness against what are relatively smaller creatures for Matthew's deck. He didn't play anything that was a particularly enormous creature. There was really a pile of 2/2s, a pile of 2/1s, maybe a 3/2 in the air, but nothing that was wildly substantial from a power and toughness perspective.
Yeah, and I mean, Matthew also, he drew less lands than Brian in that game. He had more cards to work with. Some sideboarding considerations. We know that Brian has an Adamant Will somewhere in his 75. I'm not sure if that's already in his deck. It might have been in his deck over the dub in the post-boarded game, but knowing that your opponent has a removal spell like Gideon's Reproach means that card gets a lot more powerful. Normally pump spells, you don't really want to play more than one in your deck in this format, but when your opponent ends up having at least one, maybe 2 copies of a card like Gideon's Reproach, then being able to leave open mana and then attack and then see whether or not you need to use that card before, planning out your future turn is pretty powerful.
Yeah, even does have a little bit of effectiveness against the Vicious Offering that we saw out of Matthew's deck, because in addition to giving the creature indestructible, it's actually got that +2/+2 clause on it as well, which might be able to put it outside the range of either the -2/-2 or with the kicker -5/-5.
Yeah, oh, so to clarify, the reason I was talking about it in terms of Gideon's Reproach is not because it saves the creature, because it saves the creature from Gideon's Reproach, but because Gideon's Reproach can only be used during combat.
Great point.
So it allows you to know when you need the mana for your pump spell. Where pump spells, have the drawback of potentially getting stranded in your hand.
Yeah.
And if you're playing against cards that can only be used during combat, then they become much more powerful.
That's a really interesting insight, actually, because then you know when you can commit your mana to other things.
Yeah.
Okay. Excellent. Well, Game 3 is going to be coming on up. Do you have anything that you're really looking to see in this matchup? Or really, Matthew Nicolai is fighting for a chance to be the national champion, is fighting to be part of that new era of players moving up towards the top. Personally, I'm always a big fan of watching the player that maybe I'm not familiar with putting up a really good showing against some of these top names.
Yeah, the underdog story is always the best story. Matthew Nicolai here, 7-1, excellent showing on the first day. Now he's here playing against a world champion. He's made it to Game 3. In Game 1, he got pretty unlucky. He never drew a 4th land. In Game 2, he played well. He had more cards to work with because of the way he built his deck, and he was able to grind Brian out. He set up a really nice block there. I really liked the way he lined up that turn where he had the Vicious Offering. By blocking the way that he did and then using their approach on the Aven Sentry first, he made sure that Brian didn't have the necessary pump spell to save a creature before going ahead and trying the Vicious Offering. And I thought that was a really tight play on his part.
Took me a little bit as well, because we saw that Matthew put the blocker in front of that creature before sacrificing it to the Vicious Offering. It strikes me as something that was kind of this small play, because it's going to be dying anyway, but tell me a little bit about the benefits of putting that creature as a blocker in front of it before sacrificing it to the Vicious Offering.
So if Brian is able to save his creature in some way, and he didn't block ahead of time, then whatever additional power and toughness the creature got from the way in which Brian saved the creature, Matthew would take that damage. Whereas even if Brian were able to save the creature, if Matthew Nicolai blocks first, then he's not taking any damage from that Sergeant of Arms that had been dubbed.
So that's really just a consideration of, a type play that in your ideal game plan, it will never matter. But it's playing around if something goes wrong. That's your contingency plan.
Yeah, and the reason I like that he went for the Reproach first on the Sentry is specifically because it encourages Brian to use a spell, if he does have one to save something, on the Aven Sentry, and then he knows that the Vicious Offering, where he's using 2 cards to deal with 2 cards, is actually going to go through and be effective.
So really 2 extremely wise plays to make sure that he can remove that Sergeant at Arms.
Yeah.
Very cool. So the players are lining up here. We did see a little bit of mulligans, but a huge difference from Matthew Nikolai once those land drops were hit in Game 2. So we have now had the opportunity to really see some of the power level out of this deck for Brian Brown Duin. We saw a lot more of that power level in Game 1. In Game 2, we really saw his full suite of removal, but not so much in his creature package.
Yeah, he definitely drew some of his weaker creatures. His deck has a Glut at 4 and 5 mana, and in that last game, as he hit his 4th and 5th land drops, he was playing things like Unkicked Sergeant at Arms, which is not really where Brian's deck wants to be.
So Brian down to 6 cards, going to kick things off with a short sword. That's just going to exist on the battlefield until he needs it, until another one of his creatures is ready to pick it up. It's got an extremely cheap equip cost in addition to its casting cost.
Yeah, and short sword is pretty good for lining up what attacks could be favorable for you. This is a format where a lot of the time the edge is 1 toughness over the power of whatever creature you have, and a card like Short Sword really allows you to get in.
Even in this situation here, we've now got a 2-3 in the Sergeant at Arms facing off against a 3-2 in the Deathbloom Cloud. But that Short Sword, and actually it's just going to get in, but it even offered an option of equipping it, and suddenly it beats it straight up in combat.
Yeah, and this means that Brian wants to use all of his mana this turn.
Does that leave any considerations from Matthew's side of the battlefield as to whether or not he may want to block or not?
I imagine Matthew will want to block, because if my opponent wants to use all their mana this turn, and I have a Deathbloom Thallid, then that means I'm getting a 1-1 out of the deal. They're getting nothing for their card. That seems like a fine trade. Even if they have some sort of trick to make this matter in combat, that's fine, because I'm getting a 1-1 and they're spending a card.
That's true. So Matthew Nikolai is going to gain that Sapperling, and from Brian Brown Duin, it's time to see what he wanted to do. It's the Aven Sentry coming back down. This has been on both sides of the battlefield. It's the flying 3-2. It is going to get over that Sapperling. It's also going to carry a sword pretty nicely.
Yeah, I mean, once you sort up an Aven Sentry, it's a 4-3 flyer, which can close a game very fast.
It's a 5-turn clock with 1 card. Well, 2 cards.
Yeah. And Matthew here getting in with the Sapperling. In the previous game, Brian made a block when he was in a situation like this, and he found himself on the wrong end of a fungal infection, but he's not going to make that mistake here in Game 3.
Yep, Dauntless Bodyguard comes down alongside that Pegasus Courser, and I do believe Matthew has chosen the Pegasus Courser, so has the option to sacrifice this card to give the other Pegasus Courser indestructible until end of turn. Good Bodyguard.
Yeah.
Very diligent. So it's going to be a swing in, and again, we're seeing the Short Sword not actually do anything just yet. So far, it's been a historic turn 1 play.
Yeah, Short Sword is a card that, it makes each excess mana you have more powerful, and Brian has, used all of his mana every turn since he's had a threat on the battlefield.
It's an interesting situation where actually being unable to use your Short Sword is actually kind of the best case scenario, because it means that you're still being wildly mana efficient with each of your turns.
Yeah.
So Matthew Nikolai is going to be down to 17, sitting with a pretty nice bit of damage on the other side. It's 4. 2 of it are also able to get into the air because that Pegasus Courser is able to jump another creature. From Brian Brown Duin's side, deciding how he wants this turn to go. He does have, some consideration as far as we know that he's got quite a few cards kind of at this mana cost, and how they're going to be able to line up against what it is that Matthew Nikolai is going to be doing. Especially, both of these decks have quite a bit of removal, maybe debating if he wants to open himself up to one or another.
There's probably some sort of judge call happening here. Not sure what happened, but...
Baloth Gorger is going to come down to the battlefield. It's a 4-4 for 4. That's pretty efficient.
Very much so. I mean, we talked about how good that card was. Brian saw a lot of those coming around the table pretty late. Just a really powerful card. Great power and toughness for its cost. And because Brian knows about the Gideon's Reproach, I imagine before he tangos with that card, he's going to want to try to equip that short sword.
We are seeing the first missed land drop of the game on Brian's side of the battlefield. Here's an attack in for 3. The 2 flying creatures, because that Dauntless Bodyguard, it is going to stick with its Pegasus Courser, and it's going to jump up into the air, and we get a Stronghold Confessor, and this is going to be kicked, and another Dauntless Bodyguard. This is a very aggressive black-white deck.
Yeah, lots of 1-drops here from Matthew Nikolai. This deck looks real fast.
That's going to also be protecting the Stronghold Confessor, so really that and the Pegasus Courser are the 2 best cards on Matthew Nikolai's side, and these 2 Dauntless Bodyguards very well suited to protect them through most of the tricks. Really, Blessed Light, the only option that Brian Braun-Duin has to answer them without any chance of recourse.
Yeah, and Brian does have some cards that match up well against these bodyguards. He has a Spore Swarm, but with that Pegasus Courser on the battlefield, that's less effective of an answer. I think Brian may have to start to take a defensive posture based on how quickly Matthew has played out his hand here.
Yeah, and the difficult part is that Stronghold Confessor, if that one is the card that ends up being given flying, even that one can't be blocked, though at that point Brian would have to set his sights on the Pegasus Courser and getting that off the battlefield.
Yeah, and I mean, Brian would be happy to get that block in as such, but it's scary because you know about the fungal infection.
And the Dauntless
Bodyguard. That would be such a nightmare, yeah.
Yeah, and the Dauntless Bodyguard would be able to protect the Pegasus Courser as well, so we're just going to attack in, throw down another Aven Sentry, and suit this one up with the short sword, so there is going to be that blocker on that side of the battlefield.
I mean, he's not really that worried about the Bodyguard, because if his opponent sacrifices the Bodyguard, that's still fine for him. He wouldn't spend any cards for that to happen.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
Because it does have that 2 toughness, or actually 3 toughness now that it's wearing a short sword, whereas that Pegasus Courser is just a 1/3. It would not end up actually defeating any of Brian's cards in combat.
Yeah, and now Brian, even through something like a fungal infection, would be able to happily block a Pegasus Courser.
And it's just the Stronghold Confessor that is getting in. A double block does mean losing the Aven Sentry, or just take the 3 damage.
Yeah, I like this attack a lot from Matthew Nikolai. I think he saw where he was, and
the Caligo Skin Witch comes down. We are going to lose Adamant Will, so the trick is no longer available. That means that Brian is now playing off the top of his deck. That Caligo Skin Witch, so effective, a 6-mana play, usually empties your opponent's hand.
Yeah, and because Matthew doesn't have great attacks, Brian could try to play a longer game here. The thing is, though, he just got Skin Witched for his last 2 cards. He is behind on the board. He does have these 2 flyers. He could just try to turn this into a racing situation, though it's really dependent on what he's drawn this turn.
Yeah, and because so many of those creatures on the opposing side are actually quite small, while there are 6 creatures, the damage output is actually not that high. Stronghold Confessor, functionally, one of the only creatures that actually can hit for 3, and then the Dauntless Bodyguard swinging for 2.
Yeah, and, Brian here, so let's say he drew something like Blessed Light. If he uses Blessed Light on the Pegasus Courser here, then he's attacking for 7 in the air and has a 2-turn clock. And in doing so, he would put himself in a favorable racing position. It looks like he does not have that card, because I imagine he would have gone for that.
Looks like the Pegasus Courser is going to get in front. We're going to sacrifice this Dauntless Bodyguard. That's now off the battlefield. The Pegasus Courser is going to survive, thanks to the heroic efforts of that bodyguard. Suiting up the short sword on the Baloth Gorger. Probably going to hold that one in its mouth.
Seems like a good place. He has like claws. He kind of like move it around.
That's true. Maybe just keep it underfoot.
Tie it to the side of his head.
Ooh. The Dominant Trapper is the draw here for Matthew Nikolai. Does have access to the Stronghold Confessor, which can get in uncontested because it does have that menace ability, and it looks like the Pegasus Courser are going to jump the Dauntless Bodyguard. So this is actually a swing in for 3. All of it cannot be blocked by what Brian has on his side of the battlefield. Dominant Trapper coming down. Not a whole lot of cards in hand for Matthew Nikolai, but any historic card off the top does also make his blocking situation, combat situation more favorable.
Yeah, now Brian, he attacked last turn. This turn, it seems like he's not going to be able to win the game right now, and he is up against a very scary board on the other side of the table. If he passes the turn back, unless he has some action here, he's probably just going to lose the game. The Trapper means that even leaving back these blockers, if Matthew has some sort of historic spell, that could spell at the end of the game. Brian in a really rough spot here. Matthew Nikolai's deck looks great. This is, in an excellent, aggressive white-black deck.
Yeah, we haven't really seen a whole lot that costs more than 4 out of this. And even in this game, it's been basically mono 1, 2, and 3 drop spells. But they've done such a good job of filling this board up, making combat difficult, making it to where really any of these swings in can be uncontested with Menace or Flying.
Yeah, and that Calico Skin Witch to get the last 2 cards here from Brian was just unbelievable. That Adamant Will would have been a major player here on a key turn where Brian would have tried to turn the tides.
It looks like we are going to finally see what the remaining cards in Brian's hand are. It's a Pegasus Courser and a Plains. He's empty-handed, no secrets on Brian's side of the battlefield. Matthew gets to untap and see if he can do it.
Yeah, so I imagine the short sword is just going to move over to the other Aven Sentry.
There it is. So it's a Baloth Gorger, it's a Pegasus Courser, and it's an Aven Sentry trying to hold off this field of 1/3s, of 3/2s, and 3/3s. This is a big turn.
The short sword movement was actually an interesting choice there.
Tell me.
So if he moves it to the Pegasus Courser, then the short sworded Pegasus Courser can actually block the Trapper if that gets jumped by the Courser and not die, and the Aven Sentry can block the Courser and not die, assuming that Matthew doesn't have a fungal infection. By moving it over the Aven Sentry, Brian doesn't really have a favorable block for that Trapper once it's flying via the Pegasus Courser. He's going to have to chump block with something.
Okay.
And
So
I think that may have been a bit of a misstep here, and I'm interested to see how this turns out for him.
So that short sword going to maybe just the wrong flyer could end up being really what could maybe make or break this, because even if
he could just lose anyway, for what it's worth.
Sure.
I think that in all likelihood, this game was over no matter how he chose to do that. And from the looks of things, it seems like Matthew has Invoke the Divine in hand, so the short sword's not really a relevant factor.
No, and there's still the idea that where even if Brian survives this swing, he needs to also try and have enough to actually win on the backswing, and that's going to be a difficult position with not a whole lot of favorable blocks like you described.
I like this block a lot from Brian right now. Interested to see whether or not he blocks something else, but this could put him in a position to have a shot to win the game. The Invoke the Divine, the 4 life off the Invoke the Divine, is going to be really, really rough for Brian, though.
Yeah, it's interesting to where seeing Matthew play this, I wonder if he's going to maybe try and hold on to that one as long as he possibly can rather than being proactive with it, because maybe getting Brian to walk himself into a position to get exactly the damage needed and then suddenly 4 life out of nowhere on Matthew's side of the battlefield could be really a big, big game plan for Matthew.
Yeah, so Brian here, you got to go for it, right? Your opponent's at 7, you have 7 points of flying in the air, they don't have any flyers. Come on,
let's live the
I
dream.
gotta go for it. So it's super scary, but Matthew Nikolai, we know that he has this Invoke the Divine, and that is going to keep him at 4 or keep him at 5 life after Brian's attack. In which case, he'll be able to swing back for victory.
Well, and with 2 Aven Sentries, yeah, unfortunately, that Baloth Gorger no longer able to be jumped into the air because that Pegasus Courser did end up falling in combat, but this is going to be a tricky position because it's actually, you're not only destroying the sword, which really is making it also just a swing for 6.
Leaves an extremely tight game. If Brian didn't double block the Confessor, if he just takes that damage, then if he attacks with everything here and jumps that Gorger, then even with the Invoke the Divine, it's exactly enough damage. But there's no way he could have known that. He's playing around tons of different pump spells. I think it's significantly more likely that your opponent has one of 30 cards than specifically Invoke the Divine.
He goes for it. If it's on board, maybe it's because Matthew gave you an opportunity that you didn't expect, anything like that. That was all on board. Matthew knew that was going to be coming back in the swing. He goes for it. Matthew was left at 5. That is a handshake from Brian Brown Duin, and Matthew Nikolai takes it down. A match against the world champion. We got to see it yesterday. We got to see it today. These players are coming in and showing what they can do against some of the best players in the world here at U.S. Nationals. A very impressive showing for that black-white deck.
Yeah, and, coming into day 2, having to face off against the world champion, winning your first round, Matthew Nikolai has got to be feeling good about his chances today.
All right, well, we've got more matches coming your way after these messages. Join us there. Welcome back to round 9 here at U.S. Nationals. TJ Rogers joined by Jacob Van Lunen in Columbus, Ohio. Watching these players take their shot at being the U.S. National Champion. And we are going to have a little bit of Time Walk magic available to us right now. And we're going to be kicking things off with Christopher Anderson up against Seth Manfield. It's going to be a island followed by a plains. Looks like a lot of blue. I believe Christopher Anderson ended up in sort of a blue-red strategy as we were able to watch that draft.
Yeah, Christopher has a blue-red wizard deck. His deck is not particularly strong. He does have a few powerful cards, though.
All right, and on Seth Manfield's side, it looks like he is ending up in sort of a blue-white, playing down the Relic Runner. Really leads me to think that he might have a bit of historic synergies in the deck, or it's maybe just a curve filler.
Yeah, so something pretty exciting about Seth's deck. He has 5 legendary creatures, and he has 2 copies of Karn's Temporal Sundering.
He got that foil Karn's Temporal Sundering, I bet. Oh, man, so it's a Tolarian Scholar out on the battlefield for the first play. We do see some other wizards in hand. This is a great one just to add a little bit of that creature type to the battlefield, and it's a nice first one to have, which means that all your other ones are going to start getting that enter the battlefield trigger.
Yeah, so this is going to reveal the 3rd color of Seth's deck. Oh, I guess not.
Maybe not.
Yeah, he's also playing red.
Keeping the
He's
mystery.
playing a blue-white-red historic deck here. He's got a lot of powerful cards. I'm really impressed with this deck.
So Seth trying to keep a little bit of mystery so far. He doesn't need that one yet. The double boost is apparently his priority at the moment. This is a historic card, which means that Relic Runner is actually going to be untouchable. It's, a smaller creature than this Tolarian Scholar, but no options for blocking.
Yeah, and Seth Manfield's deck has a lot of historic cards, so these Relic Runners are going to be much better in his deck than they would be in a lot of other decks.
There's the swinging for 2, the 1/2 Skittering Surveyor, not interested in getting in the way of it, and it is going to be the Gitu Journey Mage, 2 damage to Seth Manfield, starting to get a little bit of this synergy happening. Actually, both of these decks very synergy-based.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen the historic theme pushed quite as hard as it's pushed here in Seth's deck right now.
So if you have the chance, tell me a little bit, what are the hits as far as Seth Manfield?
Okay, so he has double Quende, which combos pretty nicely with a pair of Knight of Grace.
There's
and
the
Danitha.
pair of Knight of Grace hitting the battlefield already. Those are going to have double strike with a Quende out. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, he has, as far as legendary spells go, he has double Karn's Temporal Sundering and Urza's Ruinous Blast.
So the ability to not only bounce a creature, take an extra turn, 2 opportunities to do that, but also just to wipe the battlefield if he's in a negative position.
Yeah, and not only does he have these Knights, he also has a Danitha, which has first strike, so that double Quende that he has is going to be exceptionally strong. He has Evra, Halcyon Witness. He has Baird. His deck is awesome. He's splashing for Joda and a pair of Tiana Ship's Caretaker. He's just got like a wealth of riches in terms of legends, and oh my goodness.
Look at this. So we're going to see the Gitu Journey Mage and the Tolarian Scholar getting in a swing. That is a 3/2, and it's attacking into just some, first strikers. These Knights of Grace are first striking 2/2s right now. So this attack has got to mean something in hand.
Yeah, so what's odd here is that Seth might be worried about Run Amok.
And that's the case. It's going to be +3/+3, and that is going to end up taking down all 3 of those creatures. It's now a Relic Runner and a Tolarian Scholar. 3 creatures taken down by 2.
Yeah, and I mean, and taken down by 2 significantly less powerful cards. One thing that's really interesting about that play is that Run Amok is not a card that gets played very often. And against all of the premier cards like Shivan Fire, cards like Blink of an Eye, Seth Manfield set himself up to just have an unbelievably favorable block. But an off-the-wall strange card like Run Amok happened to just be the perfect card to have in that attack step for Christopher Anderson.
We saw a Weight of Memory from Seth Manfield. We saw him put the cards into his own graveyard. Do you think that's a consideration for his own benefit, or maybe to play around the potential of a Gitu Chronicler?
Yeah, so when you put cards in your opponent's graveyard, they might be able to return them back to their hand via Gitu Chronicler. They might be able to return them back to their hand via Memorial of Folly. There are a lot of advantages that can happen. The only time you really want to be milling your opponent is if they specifically put a card onto the top of their library, or if you think there's a decent chance that the game might be won by somebody running out of cards.
We also do see some more combat tricks in Christopher Anderson's hand. A Fervent Strike in that hand as well. From Seth Manfield's side, it's still just the Relic Runner. Really just trading blows back and forth. A swing for 2, a swing for 2. We saw the Skittering Surveyor try and get in the way, and now that red mana is achieved on Seth Manfield's side of the battlefield. That's a Narumeha. The 3/3 flash. Shivan Fire, though, going to come in, take it down, so no ability on that one to really stick around on the battlefield, and it's going to be a Skizzik that swings in. That's a 5/3 with haste, with trample. Suddenly Seth finds himself at 5 under quite a bit of pressure. He's got to make something happen, but he's attacking in with the Relic Runner, and it is going to be Tiana that is going to come down. This is a flying first strike, isn't it?
It matches up really nicely here.
Fire Intervention is going to put a halt to that, though. Game 2, the removal spell able to take down that flying first striking flyer, and it's going to be a Knight of Grace here for Seth Manfield. These players picking up the pace a little bit for our benefit. Thank you very much, players. And it is going to be an attack. Ooh, maybe not. All right. It's going to be a Merfolk Trickster pre-combat, tapping that one down, eliminating the abilities, and another one of these Knights of Grace joining it. Tempest Jin, 3-3-3. That's a 3-4 right now on the battlefield. Yes. Jodah Archmage Eternal coming down the flying 4-4 for 4, and I don't think that Seth is going to be doing a whole lot as far as actually spending the 5 mana to cast anything, but that's a big Jeskai flyer.
Yeah, a very, very large flyer here.
Also, oh my goodness. What is happening? Does he have even any auras or...
Wow, a Skizzik here for Christopher, too. Christopher just... He's got it all.
A short sword.
If you look at his deck list, is not how you would have imagined this would play out.
Oh my goodness. So it's a Rampaging Cyclops alongside that Tempest Jin, which is going to be a 4-5 right now. Otherwise, Jodah Archmage Eternal, Quende coming down, but with 2 of these Knights of Grace on the battlefield, there's no black permanents on the battlefield, which means that they are going to be remaining 2/2s, but that's 2/2s with a double strike.
Yeah, and to that short-sworded Tempest Jin, just holding them back here.
What a match. Oh my goodness. Memorial of Genius coming down. It is going to enter the battlefield tapped, but it's going to be a source of drawing cards later as this game sort of grinds on. Gitu Journey Mage going to come down, deal a little bit of damage. It's now 16-14. The life total parity being broken by that card, and it's back to Seth. Combat a little bit locked up at the moment. Flyers on both sides. A lot of double striking on Seth's side, but some excessively powerful cards in the field of Chris Anderson. Rampaging Cyclops, that's a card that you actually really do enjoy. Tell me a little bit about, this is the 4-4 for 4, that if it's being blocked by 2 or more creatures, it actually gets -2/-0, but you like that card.
I do like that card. I think a 4-4-4 is quite good in this format. A lot of players I respect value that card very highly, so I started valuing it higher. People like John Finkel. One thing I've noticed when I've played with the card is that because it's not a trigger, the ability on the card, it's just that if it's being blocked by 2 or more creatures to get this -2/-0, a lot of the time your opponent will double block it with a pair of 2/3s, thinking that even if you kill one of their creatures, their other one will survive. But if you kill one of their 2/3s, it becomes a 4-4 again, at which point you get to just eat one of their creatures, and you can pick up some weird 2-for-1s and almost use its negative ability as an advantage.
So we see a swing in for 5 from that Tempest Jin, followed up by a Skizzik. Keep an eye on that Tempest Jin. Its power is going to be relative to the amount of islands that Christopher Anderson controls. That toughness is static at 4, but its power is equal to the number of islands you control. That swing for 5 because it was carrying a short sword at the time. Jodah Archmage Eternal is going to swing back, and it's going to be Tiana coming on in. Can we make it happen with this 3-3? The amount of historic cards that we are seeing has just been incredible. Keep in mind that Tiana, first strike, that's a double striking 3-3 in the air because of this Quende.
Yeah, so that means that this Tiana can trade with the Tempest Jin. Christopher goes for the attack. I imagine Seth's going to go for a block here.
Run Amok coming on down, +3/+3. That's going to be a huge boost. There is only 3 toughness on the other side. That is a big hit. Seth finds himself down at 4, and the Tempest Jin remains on the battlefield. It's so interesting. Every time I see a Quende, I think, well, how many first strikers are there really in this format? And it seems like Seth got them all.
Yeah, and I mean, if Seth, remember, he has double Karn's Temporal Sundering. So if he draws an island here, things could get real interesting.
That's true. Or even the Urza's Ruinous Blast has got a lot of potential here because there's just 3 legendary creatures on that side of the battlefield. And on the opposing side, not a whole lot of options. It's going to be a Cloud Reader Sphinx, maybe the opportunity for him to set up a big play like that because those legendary sorceries are game changers.
Absolutely. And I mean, especially given the state of the board, I mean, there are no legendary creatures on the other side of the table. Yeah, Seth, he's just bottoming both cards. It looks like he is looking for either...
There we go, and Run Amok back to the hand. We know that the Run Amok is there because the Gitu Chronicler just got it. So Seth needs to make these blocks with some pretty interesting considerations in mind. Throws blocks across all the creatures. Got to respect it. That's going to be a win anyway. Christopher Anderson is going to take 2 games. That deck looked remarkable, and the amount of combat tricks, you were just talking about how you don't love them, so effective in that game.
Yeah, I mean, Run Amok there was, the best card in a number of situations. And it's crazy because Seth's deck on paper just looked incredible.
Wow. So
where Christopher's did not.
2 big name players taken down already in round 9. But we're going to have more Magic coming your way here shortly. Join us in just a little bit.